Hey guys, tonight we are taking a trip back to a decade of immense contradiction. We're heading to the Roaring Twenties in America, a time of jazz music, flapper dresses, and dazzling Art Deco skylines. But beneath this glittering surface of modernity and excess, the country was engaged in a strange and fascinating social experiment. Imagine a world where you can see the first real moving pictures, hear the first radio broadcasts, and watch cities explode upwards with new skyscrapers. But you can't legally buy a simple glass of beer. Frankly, if you wanted a cocktail after work, your journey would involve secret passwords, criminal gangs, and booze that could potentially blind you. Your quiet nightcap could literally be the last thing you ever drink. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and post your location and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey begins on a cold and busy night. It is January 16, 1920. You are in a bustling saloon in a great American city like Chicago or New York. The air is thick with cigar smoke and the smell of stale beer, but also with a strange, frantic energy. The room is packed. People are ordering 2, 3, even 4 drinks at a time, lining them up on the bar. In a corner, a group is holding a mock funeral, complete with a small coffin, for a figure they called John Barleycorn, the traditional English personification of alcohol. There is a mood of wild, last-minute celebration, but underneath it all, there is a deep and profound sense of melancholy. It feels like New Year's Eve, but instead of counting down to a new year, everyone is counting down to the end of an era. At midnight, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution will officially go into effect. At 12:01 a.m., this entire establishment, and every other saloon, bar, and brewery in the country, will become illegal. This drastic measure did not come out of nowhere. This is a mainstream historical fact that is crucial to understand. National prohibition was the result of a century of tireless activism. The temperance movement, led by powerful and highly organized groups like the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, had successfully framed alcohol as the root of all of society's problems. In their view, the saloon was not a place of harmless socializing, it was the breeding ground for poverty, crime, political corruption, and, most devastatingly, domestic violence. They argued, with great passion, that banning alcohol was a progressive social reform, a way to protect families, improve public health, and create a more moral and efficient nation. They had finally won the argument. The law itself came in 2 parts. First was the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors. Second was the Volstead Act, the federal law passed to enforce the amendment. The Volstead Act was the law that defined exactly what an intoxicating liquor was, and it set the limit at a punishingly low 0.5% alcohol by volume. Your average beer has about 5%. This meant that nearly every alcoholic beverage was now, by definition, illegal. But this leads us to our first quirky tidbit of the era, one that reveals the deep class divisions in the law from the very beginning. The Volstead Act banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. But it did not ban the private possession or consumption of alcohol that you already owned before the law went into effect. In the months leading up to January 1920, the wealthy had seen the writing on the wall. They bought out the inventories of entire liquor stores. They commissioned massive wine cellars to be built in their mansions. The writer F. Scott Fitzgerald noted that his wealthy friends had stockpiled enough liquor to last them for years. So, on this last night of legal drinking, while you and the working-class patrons of this saloon are having your last rites, the rich are simply stocking their shelves for a decade-long private party. This detail also fuels a long-running scholarly debate about the true motivations behind the Prohibition movement. Was it, as its supporters claimed, a genuinely progressive, often female-led, social reform movement aimed at protecting the family and curbing the excesses of a nation of heavy drinkers? Or, as other historians argue, was it also deeply rooted in a nativist, anti-immigrant sentiment? Was it a way for the mostly rural, Protestant, old-stock Americans to control the culture and behavior of the millions of new Catholic and Jewish immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Poland, and Eastern Europe, who crowded the saloons of the great industrial cities? The truth, as is often the case, is likely a complex and uncomfortable mixture of both. Back in the saloon, the clock on the wall is ticking relentlessly towards midnight. The bartender, a man who will be unemployed in a few minutes, makes the last call in the history of his establishment. A final, collective groan goes up from the crowd. You savor the last few sips of your beer. At precisely midnight, the bartender ceremoniously pulls the taps for the last time. The party is over. You and the other patrons file out onto the cold street. The doors of the saloon are locked behind you. All up and down the street, the lights of other saloons are going out, one by one. A strange and unfamiliar quiet begins to settle over the city's nightlife. The noble experiment, as it was called, has officially begun. The intention was to heal the nation's social ills. But as you stand on the dark sidewalk, looking at the now illegal saloon, you have a feeling it is about to create a whole new set of problems. And you are faced with a very simple, very pressing question: where on earth are you going to get a drink tomorrow? The great American drought has begun. The saloon doors are locked, the breweries are silent, and a strange new quiet has settled over the nation's social life. The intention of the 18th Amendment was to create a wall, completely sealing the country off from the evils of alcohol. But the architects of that wall, in their legislative wisdom, left a few small, but crucial, cracks in the foundation. And for you, a citizen in a newly and uncomfortably dry nation, your first survival tactic is to learn how to exploit them. Your first destination is not a shady back alley, but a respectable doctor's office. A few weeks or months into Prohibition, you find yourself feeling unwell. You're not sleeping well. You have a general sense of malaise, a touch of anxiety, a grip that you just can't seem to shake. It's nothing specific, just a feeling that the stresses of modern life are getting to be too much for your delicate constitution. You decide that what you need is not just rest, you need a tonic, a restorative to bolster your spirits. You need medical attention. You make your way to your local physician's office. You notice immediately that his waiting room is much fuller than it used to be, filled with other men and women who all seem to be suffering from a similar, vague sort of fatigue. When it's your turn, you sit before the doctor, a man with a tired but knowing look in his eyes. He asks you to describe your symptoms. You tell him about your restlessness, your anxiety, the general feeling of being run down. You explain that you just don't feel like yourself lately. The doctor listens with a grave, serious expression, perhaps nodding sympathetically. He might check your pulse. He might listen to your heart. After a moment of thoughtful contemplation, he concurs. Your condition is indeed concerning, and it requires a potent, time-tested remedy to restore your vigor. He then opens a drawer in his desk and pulls out a special, government-issued prescription pad. This is Form 1403, and it is your golden ticket. With a flourish of his fountain pen, he writes you a prescription. It is not for a pill or a tablet. It is for 1 pint of spiritus frumenti, the official, Latin term for whiskey. The prescription might note that it is to be taken in doses of 1 tablespoon every few hours, to combat malaise. This is the mainstream historical fact that represents the single biggest loophole in the Volstead Act. The law, while banning recreational alcohol, made a specific exception for medicinal liquor. And almost overnight, the American medical community rose to the occasion, diagnosing a wide variety of ailments for which the only effective cure, it seemed, was a pint of aged bourbon or brandy. You take your precious slip of paper and walk down the street to the local pharmacy. The pharmacy, once a place for tonics and sodas, now has the air of a secretive, but legal, dispensary. You hand your prescription to the pharmacist. He gives it a cursory glance, stamps it, and then disappears into a back room. He returns not with a small bottle of pills, but with a pint bottle of whiskey, perhaps from a well-known brand like Old Grandad or Shenley. The bottle is sealed and often has an official-looking label wrapped around it, proclaiming, "For medicinal purposes only." You have just successfully, and completely legally, purchased a bottle of whiskey in the heart of Prohibition America. The scale of this loophole was truly staggering. The number of physicians who registered for the special prescription pads, and the number of pharmacists who applied for licenses to dispense liquor, skyrocketed. In the first year of Prohibition alone, doctors wrote millions of prescriptions for alcoholic spirits. Great American distilleries, which should have gone out of business, were granted federal licenses to continue producing their whiskey to supply this booming medical market. And this leads us to a quirky and amusing tidbit: the sheer range of ailments for which whiskey was prescribed. It was recommended by physicians as a cure for everything from depression, anxiety, and insomnia to indigestion, heart problems, high blood pressure, and even cancer. It was, in effect, The go-to cure-all for any complaint a patient might have, a veritable snake oil now sanctioned by the federal government and prescribed by licensed doctors. This nationwide phenomenon raises a fascinating scholarly debate about the motivations of the thousands of doctors who participated. Were they acting out of a genuine, if archaic, medical belief in the healing properties of alcohol? After all, for centuries, spirits had been used as a tonic and a restorative. Or were they simply cynical businessmen, taking advantage of a flawed law to do a roaring trade in $10 prescriptions? Or, a third possibility, were many of them acting out of a quiet sense of civil disobedience, believing the law to be a foolish and intrusive overreach, and seeing it as their duty to help their patients circumvent it with a knowing wink and a nod? The truth is likely a mixture of all three. There were, of course, limitations. The law stipulated that a person could only be prescribed 1 pint of spirits every 10 days. So, while it was a reliable and legal source of alcohol, it was not nearly enough to satisfy a dedicated drinker or to supply a party. It was a crack in the wall of prohibition, but it was not a hole big enough for the nation's full thirst to pass through. You walk out of the pharmacy, the bottle of medicine safely tucked away. You have learned your first, crucial lesson in surviving this new, dry era. The law may be the law, but human ingenuity is eternal. You have discovered that while the government has closed the saloons, it has inadvertently turned every doctor's office into a confessional of vague symptoms, and every pharmacy into a high-end, government-approved liquor store. The noble experiment has barely begun, and already, it is beginning to look like a national farce. Your legally acquired, medicinal pint of whiskey provides a certain amount of comfort, but it is a quiet and lonely comfort. What you miss is the atmosphere of the old saloon, the music, the chatter, the feeling of being part of a crowd. The government has made that illegal, but you are beginning to learn that in this new era, there is a difference between what is legal and what is available. For a real drink, for a real night out, you need to leave the world of prescriptions and pharmacies behind. You need to go underground. You need to find a speakeasy. You can't find one by looking in a directory or asking for directions. The locations of these illegal drinking dens were a closely guarded secret, constantly changing to stay one step ahead of the law. Finding one required a connection. You might get a tip from a friend, a scribbled address on a napkin. A taxi driver might discreetly hand you a business card for what appears to be a tailor shop, but with a knowing look in his eye. The first step to surviving prohibition is learning how to navigate this new, secret, word-of-mouth network. Following a whispered tip, you find yourself on a quiet, respectable-looking street. You arrive at the address you were given. It appears to be a small, unassuming flower shop. The lights are off, and there is a closed sign in the window. There is no sound, no sign of life. For a moment, you think you have been fooled. But you were given instructions. You walk down the adjacent alleyway and find a single, plain, unmarked door. This is it. You knock, perhaps a specific rhythm you were told to use. For a long moment, nothing happens. Then, a small slot in the door at eye level slides open with a dry, scraping sound. A pair of suspicious eyes peer out at you. A gruff voice from behind the door asks, "Who sent you?" or demands a password. "Gus sent me," you might reply, your heart pounding a little. Or you might give the password of the week, something absurd like "the eagle flies at midnight." This ritual of the peephole and the password is the mainstream historical fact of speakeasy culture, a small piece of theater that separated the legitimate from the illegitimate, the outsider from the insider. The eyes look you over one more time. Then you hear the satisfying thud of a heavy bolt being drawn back. The door creaks open just enough for you to slip inside, and it is immediately closed and bolted behind you. The contrast is staggering. You have stepped from a silent, dark alleyway into a different universe. The air is hot, thick with cigarette smoke, and buzzing with energy. A jazz band is playing loud and fast in the corner. The room is packed with people talking, laughing, and dancing on a tiny, crowded dance floor. You have found it. You notice something else that is revolutionary for the time. Men and women are mingling freely, drinking together at the same tables. Before Prohibition, the saloon was almost exclusively a male domain. The speakeasy, by its very nature as a secret, anything-goes kind of place, broke down these old social barriers. It was here that the flapper culture of the Roaring Twenties was born, a world of short skirts, short hair, and new, modern social freedoms. You make your way to the bar. You can't just order a whiskey. You might order a cup of coffee or a pot of tea, which is code. The bartender will then serve you your illegal liquor in a teacup or a coffee mug, a flimsy disguise in case of a police raid. And the liquor itself is often of a questionable quality. Harsh, homemade gin and poorly distilled bootleg whiskey were the norm. This leads us to a quirky and delicious historical tidbit, the golden age of the cocktail. The skilled bartenders of the speakeasy era became expert mixologists out of necessity. They invented countless new and complex cocktails, like the bee's knees, with lemon juice and honey, or the sidecar, with orange liqueur and lemon juice, specifically to mask the foul, chemical taste of the raw, bootleg alcohol. The cocktail wasn't just a fancy drink, it was a form of camouflage for bad booze. The very existence of these places, which flourished in every city, raises a scholarly debate about their true social impact. Were speakeasies genuinely democratizing spaces, as the myth suggests? Were they places where different social classes, races, and genders could finally mingle in ways that were impossible in the more rigid, pre-prohibition world? Or was this social mixing largely a romantic myth, with most speakeasies remaining segregated by class and race, catering primarily to a wealthy, white, urban clientele who were treating the law as a fashionable game? As you sit, sipping your cocktail from a teacup and listening to the jazz band, you feel the thrill of the illicit. You are breaking the law, and so is everyone else in this crowded, smoky room. There is a constant, low-level hum of danger beneath the music and the laughter. Everyone has a plan for what to do if they hear the 3 sharp whistles that signal a police raid. But the danger is part of the appeal. It makes the drinks taste better, the music sounds sweeter. You now understand that the speakeasy was much more than just an illegal bar. It was the defiant heart of the Roaring Twenties. It was a cultural laboratory where new music, new fashions, and new social rules were being invented every night. You have successfully navigated the secret geography of your city and passed the test at the door. You are now part of the great, open secret of Prohibition America. You are sitting in the warm, smoky haze of the speakeasy, the sound of the jazz band washing over you. You take a sip of your cocktail, the gin is harsh, but the lemon and honey do their best to mask it. And as you look at the glass in your hand, a simple question forms in your mind: where did this actually come from? The great distilleries and breweries are all officially closed. The legal supply of medicinal whiskey is just a tiny trickle. So how is this bar, and thousands like it across the country, stocked with liquor every single night? The answer takes you out of the glamorous city club and into the dangerous, sprawling, and highly profitable world of the bootleggers' supply chain. The illegal alcohol that filled your glass came from one of 2 main sources. It was either secretly made here, in America, or it was smuggled in from abroad. Let's first travel to its domestic source. The scene shifts from the roaring city to the deep, quiet, and isolated hollows of the Appalachian Mountains. Here, hidden from the main roads, under the cover of thick forest, a different kind of craftsman is at work. You see a ramshackle shelter built over a stream. The air is thick with the sweet, heavy smell of fermenting corn mash. This is the domain of the moonshiner. For generations, people in these hills have been turning their surplus corn into high-proof whiskey, and Prohibition has just turned their small-scale folk tradition into a booming, if highly illegal, industry. You see the still itself, a beautiful, if crude, contraption of copper pots and tubing, with a fire burning steadily beneath it. You watch as the clear, fiery liquid, the UN-aged corn whiskey known as White Lightning or Moonshine, drips steadily from the end of a copper coil into a clay jug. This is dangerous work. The threat is not just from the risk of the still itself exploding, but from the constant fear of federal revenue agents, the revenuers who hunt for the telltale signs of smoke in these hills. But while moonshine supplied a significant part of the market, especially in rural areas, the real volume, the liquor that supplied the great city speakeasies, came from overseas. This brings us to the second, and much larger, part of the supply chain, the rum runners. This is the mainstream historical fact that defined the era's smuggling operations. Imagine you are on a small, dark boat in the middle of the night, a few miles off the coast of New Jersey or Long Island. The sea is choppy. In the distance, you see a line of dark shapes on the horizon, each showing a faint light. This is Rum Row. It is a massive, floating liquor store, a fleet of large cargo ships that have sailed from Canada, the Caribbean, and Europe, laden with crates of Canadian whiskey, Caribbean rum, and French champagne. They anchored just outside the U.S. maritime limit, at first 3 miles, and later extended to 12, in international waters, where the U.S. Coast Guard has no jurisdiction. They simply wait for their customers. And you are one of those customers. Your boat is a contact boat, a small, light, and incredibly fast vessel, its engine specially modified for speed. You pull alongside one of the great motherships, a tense transaction takes place over the water, and your boat is loaded with as many crates of illicit booze as it can carry. Now comes the most dangerous part, the high-speed run back to shore. You are racing against the dawn and against the patrol boats of the Coast Guard, who are waiting just inside the maritime limit. It's a terrifying, exhilarating chase through the dark waves. Your destination is a hidden cove, a quiet beach, or a fog-shrouded dock where a truck is waiting to quickly unload your precious cargo before you disappear back into the night. The men who did this work were legends. The most famous was Captain Bill McCoy, a former boat builder who became one of the most successful rum runners on the East Coast. He was known for selling only high-quality, unadulterated liquor, never watering it down. His product was so reliable that people began referring to it as the real McCoy, a phrase that has entered the language as a term for something authentic and of high quality. This brings us to a quirky tidbit of the era, the sheer ingenuity of the smugglers. To avoid capture, they developed all sorts of clever concealment methods. Trucks were fitted with false floors and hidden compartments. Some rum runners even developed submersible torpedo-like devices that could be filled with liquor and towed secretly underwater behind their boats, invisible to the patrols on the surface. This entire vast, criminal enterprise leads to a scholarly debate. What was the true structure of the bootlegging economy? Was it, as popular culture often suggests, controlled entirely by a few large, powerful, and violent criminal syndicates like Al Capone's in Chicago? Or was it, as many historians now argue, a much more decentralized and diverse black market, made up of thousands of smaller, independent operators, the family of moonshiners in Tennessee, the small boat owner on the coast, the guy driving a modified Ford across the frozen Detroit River from Canada in the dead of winter? The answer is likely that it was a complex ecosystem of both. You are back in your comfortable seat in the speakeasy. You look at your glass with a new sense of awe. The gin in your cocktail might have been distilled last week in a hidden back room just a few blocks away. The whiskey in your friend's glass, however, may have had a much grander journey. It might have been distilled in Scotland, sailed across the Atlantic, transferred to a rum runner's speedboat on Rum Row, landed on a moonless beach in New Jersey, driven to a secret warehouse in the city, and finally, delivered to the back door of this very establishment. Your simple drink is the endpoint of a massive, dangerous, and incredibly complex international supply chain, all created from scratch to defy a single, unpopular law. You are sitting in the speakeasy, the jazz music playing, the illegal cocktail cool in your hand. You now understand the vast, shadowy, and dangerous supply chain that brought this drink to you, the hidden stills of the moonshiners, the high-speed boats of the rum runners. But as you lift the glass to your lips, you must confront the final and most personal danger of all. It's not about getting caught by the police. It's about the contents of the glass itself. In an unregulated black market, how do you know what you're drinking is safe? The truth is, you don't. The smuggled liquor, the whiskey and rum supplied by respected bootleggers like Bill McCoy, the real McCoy, was generally safe and of high quality, but it was also very expensive. The much cheaper alcohol, the kind that supplied the thousands of less reputable speakeasies and backroom joints, was a far more dangerous gamble. This was the world of homemade hooch, and its most famous product was bathtub gin. Now, the term bathtub gin is a little misleading. It rarely involved making gin in an actual bathtub. The name became a catch-all term for any kind of amateurishly produced, homemade spirits. The most common method was to take raw, industrial-grade grain alcohol, which was harsh and undrinkable on its own, and transform it into gin. This was done by mixing it with water and adding a few key ingredients to give it its characteristic flavor, juniper oil for the piney taste, and perhaps a little glycerin to give it a smoother, oilier mouthfeel. It was a crude, simple process that could be done in any back room or kitchen. But where did the bootleggers get this raw industrial alcohol? This is where the story takes a dark and dangerous turn, and where we find the mainstream historical fact that explains why Prohibition-era booze could be so deadly. Alcohol is a vital component in countless industrial processes. It's used to make perfumes, antifreeze, paint, varnish, and fuel. The government couldn't ban industrial alcohol entirely. So, to prevent people from drinking it, the law required manufacturers to denature it. This meant they had to add poisonous chemicals to make it unpotable. The primary poison used was methyl alcohol, also known as methanol or wood alcohol. It's chemically similar to the ethanol we drink, but it is metabolized very differently by the human body. Bootleggers would obtain huge quantities of this poisoned industrial alcohol, often by bribing factory workers or hijacking shipments. They would then attempt to renature it, using crude chemical processes to try and remove the methanol and other poisons. The problem is, they were often terrible chemists, and their methods were almost always unsuccessful. This meant that a huge percentage of the cheap liquor being sold across the country was tainted with a deadly poison, put there by the government itself. When a person drinks methanol, the consequences are horrific. The poison specifically attacks the central nervous system and, most famously, the optic nerve. The first symptoms are dizziness and nausea, but they are soon followed by blurred vision, and then, often, complete and irreversible blindness. In larger doses, methanol causes organ failure, paralysis, and a painful, agonizing death. It is estimated that during Prohibition, at least 10,000 people were killed by drinking this tainted alcohol, and many more were left permanently blind or paralyzed. This widespread poisoning gave rise to its own quirky and tragic slang. A common affliction was a type of paralysis caused by a contaminated brand of Jamaican ginger extract, which was sold as a medicinal product. The condition, which caused people to walk with a strange, high-stepping gait, became known as the Ginger Jake, or simply Jake-like. A tainted cocktail was sometimes called a bum drink, and the poisonous wood alcohol itself was often referred to grimly as the smoke. This leads to a deeply troubling scholarly debate about the ethics of the government's own actions. The federal government was fully aware that bootleggers were using denatured alcohol and that people were dying from it. In fact, as the problem grew, some officials in the Treasury Department ordered manufacturers to add even more, and even deadlier, poisons to the industrial supply, hoping to scare people into sobriety. Was this, as the government claimed, a legitimate, if harsh, law enforcement strategy designed to uphold the 18th Amendment? Or was it, as its critics argued then and now, a shockingly cynical and cruel policy, a form of chemical warfare waged against its own citizens, where the government was knowingly and directly responsible for the deaths and blinding of thousands of its own people? You looked down at the cocktail in your hand with a new sense of profound unease. Every time you ordered a drink in a speakeasy, you were playing a game of Russian roulette. You had to place your complete trust in the man who ran the bar, and in the bootlegger who supplied him. A new, cheaper supplier, a misstep in the renaturing process, and your next sip could be your last. The noble experiment, designed to protect the nation from the health problems of alcoholism, had ironically made the simple act of having a drink one of the most dangerous and potentially fatal things a person could do. Your survival in this era now depends not just on avoiding the law, but on the terrifying gamble of avoiding the liquor itself. You swirl the suspect cocktail in your teacup, the fear of methanol poisoning making you hesitate. You would gladly pay a higher price for a drink if you could be certain it was safe. You, and millions of others, are craving a product that is not just available, but reliable. You are craving quality control. And in this new, illicit marketplace, this demand for a dependable and safe supply of alcohol created the single greatest business opportunity in the history of the American underworld. The noble experiment is about to give rise to the golden age of the American gangster. Before 1920, organized crime in America certainly existed, but it was a relatively small-scale and fragmented affair. There were neighborhood street gangs, primarily involved in gambling, theft, and prostitution. But Prohibition changed the game completely. Overnight, the government had outlawed a product that tens of millions of people still desperately wanted. They had created a nationwide, billion-dollar black market, and the only people equipped to service that market were those who were already comfortable operating outside the law. Bootlegging was a far more complex business than running a neighborhood gambling den. It required a level of organization that transformed these small street gangs into sophisticated criminal corporations. First, you needed to control the supply, either by operating your own network of hidden stills and breweries, or by managing the importation of liquor from Canada or the Caribbean. Second, you needed logistics, a fleet of fast cars and powerful trucks, and a small army of drivers to move the product. Third, you needed warehousing, secure locations to store thousands of crates of booze. Fourth, you needed a distribution network to deliver the product to hundreds, or even thousands, of speakeasies. And finally, you needed enforcement, a private army of gunmen to protect your shipments from rival gangs and to convince speakeasy owners to buy your product and pay for your protection. No figure better illustrates this transformation from thug to CEO than the most famous gangster of all time, Al Capone. This is a mainstream historical fact that is impossible to ignore. Capone built a criminal empire in Chicago that was run with the ruthless efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. His organization controlled the flow of high-quality Canadian whiskey, running it down through a network of highways to Chicago. He owned breweries that operated in plain sight, protected by the bribes he paid to police and politicians. He forced nearly every speakeasy in the city to buy his liquor at his prices. At the height of his power, it is estimated his empire was grossing over $100 million a year, an almost unimaginable sum in the 1920s. Of course, this business was enforced not with contracts, but with violence. The competition between rival gangs for control of the lucrative bootlegging territories was brutally violent. This culminated in the most infamous gangland killing in American history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. Capone's men, disguised as police officers, entered a warehouse used by the rival North Side gang. They lined 7 of their opponents up against a wall and executed them with machine guns. It was a cold, calculated, corporate-style hit, designed to eliminate the competition. This leads to a quirky and important tidbit about the broader structure of organized crime in this era. While Capone was consolidating his power in Chicago with violence, gangsters in New York were learning a different lesson. Ambitious young criminals like Charles Lucky Luciano, an Italian, and his close associate Meyer Lansky, who was Jewish, realized that the old ethnic rivalries were bad for business. There was more than enough money to go around. They helped to forge a new kind of criminal organization, a national crime syndicate, where the leaders of the various Italian, Jewish, and Irish mobs would cooperate. They formed a board of directors, sometimes called the Commission, to mediate disputes, set territories, and maximize profits for everyone. Prohibition, in a strange way, was the great unifier of the American mafia, forcing old neighborhood rivals to think like modern corporate executives. The spectacular rise of these gangster empires, with their immense wealth and their shocking public violence, leads to a scholarly debate about the era's lasting impact. Did Prohibition and the rise of the celebrity gangster permanently glamorize the figure of the outlaw in American culture? And did the widespread, open corruption of police, judges, and politicians with mob money create a deep and lasting cynicism towards the rule of law itself, a feeling that the whole system was rigged? Many historians argue that the damage done to public trust during this era was one of Prohibition's most destructive legacies. You're back in your seat at the speakeasy. You now understand the invisible architecture that makes this secret world possible. The reason the jazz band can play, the reason the bartender can operate without fear, and the reason the gin in your glass is probably, hopefully, safe to drink, is because the owner of this establishment pays a weekly tribute to a powerful crime syndicate. The booze is supplied by their trucks, and the police are kept away by their bribes. You look around the room at the laughing, dancing crowd. They are all, in their own small way, contributing to the immense power of men like Al Capone. You now understand that the noble experiment did not end the liquor business. It simply performed a hostile takeover, transferring the industry from legal, tax-paying brewers and distillers, to a new, fabulously wealthy, and ruthlessly violent class of criminal entrepreneurs. You are immersed in the world of the bootlegger. The criminal empires built by men like Al Capone seem all-powerful, their control over the nation's illegal liquor supply absolute, their power enforced by bribery and bloodshed. But the United States government, having passed this noble experiment into law, did not simply stand by and watch it fail. It declared war. And you will now see this long and frustrating conflict from the perspective of the soldiers on the front lines, the federal prohibition agents. To enforce the Volstead Act, the government created a new federal agency, the Bureau of Prohibition. From the very beginning, it was a troubled organization. It was housed within the Treasury Department. It was chronically underfunded, and it was tasked with policing the behavior of an entire nation of thirsty citizens. The agents themselves, nicknamed PROs, were a mixed bag. The job was dangerous and the pay was low, which made them incredibly susceptible to the massive bribes offered by the wealthy bootlegging syndicates. Corruption was rampant, but not all the agents were corrupt. Many were genuinely idealistic, true believers in the cause of temperance who saw themselves as moral crusaders. Others were simply dedicated lawmen, drawn to the thrill and the challenge of taking on the country's most powerful new criminal empires. Theirs was a thankless and incredibly dangerous job. Imagine a day in the life of a prohibition agent. It might begin with a raid on a suspected speakeasy. You and your fellow agents, armed with pistols and heavy axes, would smash through the hidden door, sending the patrons scattering. You would then set about the grim work of destruction, using your axes to shatter barrels of beer, to smash crate after crate of whiskey bottles, the sharp, pungent smell of the illegal liquor filling the air as it gurgled into the gutters. Another day might find you engaged in a high-speed chase on a lonely country road at night, your unarmored government car trying to keep up with a bootlegger's modified Cadillac, its suspension beefed up to handle the weight of hundreds of gallons of moonshine. These chases often ended in shootouts, with both sides armed and willing to use deadly force. Or you might be trekking deep into the Appalachian Hills, following a tip to find and destroy a hidden moonshine still, facing the resentment and potential violence of the local community who saw you as an invader. This constant battle created some legendary figures. This brings us to a quirky and entertaining tidbit from the annals of law enforcement, the story of Izzy Einstein and Mo Smith. They were two of the most famous and successful Prohibition agents in New York City, not because they were tough gunslingers, but because they were masters of disguise and theatricality. They would pose as anything to gain entry to a speakeasy, as German opera singers, Texas cattlemen, gravediggers, or even as a couple on a date. Once inside, they would order a drink, and as soon as it was served, they would dramatically reveal their badges and declare the establishment under arrest. They made nearly 5,000 arrests in just a few years, using humor and cleverness as their primary weapons. But the most famous agent of all, the man whose name became synonymous with the fight against the mob, was Eliot Ness. This is the mainstream historical fact of Prohibition enforcement. In Chicago, Ness was tasked with leading a small, hand-picked team of agents to take on Al Capone's massive empire. Ness and his men knew they couldn't arrest every bootlegger or raid every speakeasy. Instead, they focused on disrupting Capone's business, targeting his largest, most profitable illegal breweries and distilleries, costing him millions of dollars in lost product. They became famous for their bravery and, most importantly, for their incorruptibility. Capone's syndicate tried to bribe them, offering them huge sums of money to look the other way. Ness and his team publicly refused the bribes, earning them the famous nickname given to them by the press, the Untouchables. The story of Ness and his Untouchables, a small band of heroes taking on the country's most powerful gangster, is a powerful one, immortalized in television and movies. The reality, however, was a bit more complicated. While Ness and his team were a genuine nuisance to Capone, they were not the ones who ultimately brought him down. The man who defeated Al Capone was not a gunslinger, but an accountant. It was the quiet, meticulous work of financial investigators from the Treasury Department that convicted Capone not of murder or bootlegging, but of federal income tax evasion, finally sending him to prison. This all leads to the great scholarly debate about Prohibition enforcement. Was it a complete and total failure? After all, anyone who wanted a drink during Prohibition could almost always find one. The law was flouted on a massive scale. Or, as some revisionist historians argue, did the enforcement, for all its flaws and corruption, actually succeed in some of its goals? They point to statistics that show a significant decline in overall alcohol consumption during the 1920s, especially among the working class who could not afford the high prices of illegal booze. In this view, Prohibition, while a failure in many ways, may have had some positive public health outcomes. You now see the other side of the Roaring Twenties nightlife. For every glamorous speakeasy, there was the constant threat of an axe crashing through the door. For every wealthy gangster, there was a dedicated, if often outgunned, federal agent trying to dismantle his empire. You understand now that Prohibition was not just a law, it was a war. It was a long, bloody, and frustrating war, fought by a handful of agents against a vast criminal conspiracy, an enormous public demand, and a deep-seated culture of corruption. They were trying to enforce an unenforceable law, a noble and impossible experiment. You have now seen the dark underbelly of the noble experiment. You have witnessed the grim war between the bootleggers and the federal agents, a conflict fought with machine guns, back alley bribes, and poison liquor. It is a story of crime, corruption, and violence. But history is full of strange ironies. And the greatest irony of Prohibition is that this repressive, conservative law, intended to enforce a strict moral code on the nation, ended up accidentally fueling one of the most explosive and liberating cultural revolutions in American history. To see it, you just have to step back inside the speakeasy. Before Prohibition, the American saloon was a spit and sawdust kind of place. It was overwhelmingly male, it was often tied to local political machines, and it was not considered a respectable place for women to be seen. By making the saloon illegal, the 18th Amendment didn't just ban drinking, it destroyed an entire social institution. And in its place, a new, secret, and very different kind of institution grew, the speakeasy. And this secret club became a laboratory for a new kind of American culture. The most visible symbol of this cultural shift was the new woman, the icon of the decade, the flapper. This is a mainstream historical fact that is impossible to separate from the era. Before the war, a respectable woman wore her hair long and her hemlines longer. After the war, and in the smoky, liberated atmosphere of the speakeasy, a new ideal emerged. You see her on the dance floor. Her hair is cut into a short, daring bob. Her dress is loose and straight, the hemline shockingly raised to just below the knee, designed to kick and fly as she dances. She wears makeup, she smokes cigarettes in public from a long holder, and she sips a cocktail from a teacup, meeting men's gazes with a confidence that would have been scandalous just a decade earlier. The flapper was a declaration of independence, and the speakeasy was her natural habitat. And what was she dancing to? The speakeasies, run by gangsters who wanted to keep their customers drinking and happy, needed entertainment. And the sound that filled these illegal clubs was a new, energetic, and uniquely American music that had migrated up from the black communities of New Orleans, jazz. You hear the syncopated rhythms of the piano, the wail of a trumpet, the improvisational genius of a clarinet solo. It was a music that was vibrant, modern, and slightly dangerous, the perfect soundtrack for an illegal night out. And with the new music came new dances, like the wild, kicking, frenetic Charleston, a dance that would have given the upright members of the temperance movement a collective heart attack. The speakeasy also fundamentally changed the rules of dating and socializing. For the first time, young, unmarried men and women were mixing and drinking together in a semi-public setting. This was a radical social shift. The speakeasy became the primary destination for a date, a place where a young couple could escape the watchful eyes of their parents and enjoy a new, modern kind of courtship, fueled by jazz music and illegal cocktails. This new culture of home entertainment leads us to a quirky and enduring tidbit. With public bars closed, people who wanted to socialize had to do so in their own homes. This gave rise to a new social ritual, the cocktail party. Before Prohibition, people drank straight whiskey or beer. But now, with the available liquor often being harsh, homemade bathtub gin, hosts needed a way to make it more palatable. They began to mix the raw spirits with fruit juices, sodas, and other flavorings, and serve them in small glasses. The cocktail, a tool for masking bad booze, became the centerpiece of a new form of sophisticated home entertaining that has remained with us ever since. This entire cultural explosion raises a fascinating question for historians. Did Prohibition actually create the Roaring Twenties? Or did it simply accelerate a revolution that was already underway? This is a scholarly debate with compelling arguments on both sides. Some argue that the social shifts were already in motion, powered by the end of World War I, the success of the women's suffrage movement, and the growing urbanization of the country. In this view, the speakeasy didn't create the flapper, it just gave her a place to dance. But other historians argue that by breaking the old saloon culture and forcing social life into new, unregulated, underground spaces, Prohibition directly caused these changes to happen faster and in more radical ways than they otherwise would have. You look around the crowded, noisy, smoke-filled room with a new understanding. This place is not just an illegal bar. It is the beating heart of a revolution. It is a place where social classes end, in some progressive establishments, even races could mingle in ways that were unthinkable before. It is the place where a new kind of woman declared her independence, where a new kind of music found its voice, and where new rules for modern social life were being written every night. Here lies the greatest paradox of the noble experiment. A law, passed by rural, religious traditionalists to promote sobriety and social control, had resulted in the creation of an urban, secular, and wildly liberated new culture. In their attempt to shut down the party, they had accidentally made it more exciting, more glamorous, and more culturally significant than it had ever been before. You are in the heart of the jazz age, a secret world of cocktails and cultural revolution that exists in the shadows of the law. The party of the Roaring Twenties seems like it will never end. But outside the speakeasy's hidden door, the decade itself is drawing to a close, and the foundations of this entire glittering, illegal world are beginning to crack. The nation is starting to sober up, not from a change of heart, but from a growing, collective headache caused by the disastrous unintended consequences of its noble experiment. By the late 1920s, the initial optimism that had fueled the passage of the 18th Amendment had all but vanished. The promised benefits of a dry America had failed to materialize. In fact, many of the social ills that Prohibition was meant to cure had seemingly gotten worse. The spectacular violence of organized crime, which had once seemed like a thrilling story in the newspapers, now felt like a national crisis. The open and widespread flouting of the law, from college students to congressmen, was creating a deep and corrosive disrespect for the rule of law itself. And the government's massive enforcement efforts had clearly failed to stop the flow of liquor. The noble experiment was beginning to look like a noble failure. And then, in October of 1929, the party came to a crashing, definitive end. The stock market collapsed, plunging the United States and the world into the Great Depression. This is the mainstream historical fact that served as the final nail in the coffin for Prohibition. The decade of frantic, debt-fueled prosperity was over, replaced by an era of profound economic hardship, mass unemployment, and desperate poverty. And in this new, grim reality, the arguments against Prohibition shifted from the social to the economic, and they became impossible to ignore. The first argument was jobs. With millions of Americans out of work and standing in breadlines, the idea of keeping thousands of breweries, distilleries, bottling plants, and trucking companies legally shuttered seemed insane. The anti-prohibition movement, known as the Wets, began to argue convincingly that repealing the 18th Amendment would create thousands of much-needed, legitimate jobs. The second, and even more powerful, argument was taxes. The federal government's budget had been devastated by the economic collapse, and it was desperate for new sources of revenue to fund relief programs. Meanwhile, a billion-dollar-a-year industry in illegal alcohol was operating completely tax-free, its immense profits flowing directly into the pockets of men like Al Capone. The Wets argued that legalizing and taxing the sale of alcohol would provide a massive, life-saving infusion of cash into the national treasury. The idea of letting gangsters get rich while the government went broke began to seem not just foolish, but deeply unpatriotic. This changing public mood is best illustrated by a quirky and fascinating political turnabout. The original push for Prohibition had been led by powerful women's groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who argued it was necessary to protect the home and family. But now, a new and equally powerful women's group emerged to lead the charge for repeal. The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, or the WNPR, was founded by a wealthy and politically connected New York socialite named Pauline Sabine. Sabine and her organization brilliantly co-opted the very same arguments that the Dries had used. They argued that Prohibition, far from protecting the family, was actually destroying it. It had created a culture of secret drinking, turned law-abiding citizens into criminals, glamorized the gangster, and worst of all, it had exposed their children to the cynical, hypocritical world of the speakeasy. It was a masterful political reversal, and it shattered the idea that all respectable women supported Prohibition. This all leads to a scholarly debate that continues to this day. What was the true, primary driver for the repeal of Prohibition? Was it, as many argue, a pragmatic and purely economic decision, a desperate response to the fiscal crisis of the Great Depression that made the moral arguments of the Dries seem like an unaffordable luxury? Or was it a broader social and moral rejection of the law? Had the public simply grown tired of the crime, the corruption, the hypocrisy, and the government's intrusion into their private lives? The reality is that these two forces, the economic and the social, were perfectly intertwined, creating a powerful, unstoppable political movement. You can feel this shift all around you. The politician who once praised the virtues of a dry nation now speaks of the economic benefits of legal beer. The newspapers that once condemned the evils of the saloon now publish editorials about the need for new tax revenue. The Democratic Party, in the presidential election of 1932, makes the repeal of Prohibition a central plank of its platform, and its candidate, Franklin D. Roosevelt, rides a wave of public support to a landslide victory. The grand coalition of moral reformers who had passed the 18th Amendment has crumbled. It has been replaced by a new, and even more powerful, coalition, working-class voters who want their beer back, business leaders who see an opportunity for new industry, and a desperate government that needs the money. The noble experiment, born in an era of post-war optimism and moral certainty, cannot survive in a new age of economic desperation and profound cynicism. The end is near. The only question left is when, and how, the final curtain will fall. The year is 1932. The nation is in the depths of the Great Depression, and the public has turned decisively against the noble experiment. The political will to maintain Prohibition has evaporated, crushed under the weight of rampant crime, widespread hypocrisy, and a desperate need for jobs and tax revenue. The only question left is how to dismantle the complex legal machinery of the 18th Amendment. The end comes not all at once, but in two decisive steps. The first sign of the coming thaw arrives in March of 1933. The newly elected president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had campaigned on a platform of repealing Prohibition, signs the Cullen-Harrison Act. This clever piece of legislation didn't end Prohibition outright, but it amended the old Volstead Act, declaring that beer with an alcohol content of 3.2% was not, in fact, an intoxicating beverage. It was a legal workaround, a way to get the breweries working and the beer flowing while the slow process of constitutional repeal was underway. After signing the act, Roosevelt famously remarked to the press, "I think this would be a good time for a beer." The country agreed. On April 7, 1933, legal beer went on sale for the first time in 13 years, and massive, joyous crowds lined up outside the breweries. The dam was beginning to break. The final, definitive end, however, required something that had never been done before in American history, the repeal of a constitutional amendment. This brings us to our final mainstream historical fact. Congress proposed the 21st Amendment, a simple and direct text that just said the 18th Amendment was hereby repealed. It was then sent to the states for ratification, not by their legislatures, but by special state conventions, a process thought to be faster and more reflective of the popular will. Throughout 1933, state after state voted for repeal. The nation watched the tally like scoreboard. And on the evening of December 5, 1933, the state of Utah, of all places, became the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, providing the three-quarters majority needed. The news flashed across the country via radio and telegraph. It was official. The noble experiment was over. The reaction was instantaneous and jubilant. Spontaneous celebrations erupted in cities across the country. People danced in the streets. The old speakeasies threw open their doors, no longer needing the pretense of secrecy. In hotels and restaurants, waiters began ceremoniously tearing the wine list pages out of old menus. The unofficial anthem of Roosevelt's campaign, the song "Happy Days Are Here Again," became the soundtrack to a national sigh of relief. The 13-year-long thirst was finally over. This leads to a quirky and wonderful tidbit of corporate resilience. The great American brewing companies, like Anheuser-Busch, had been forced to find creative ways to survive the long drought. They had converted their massive facilities to produce other products, a near beer called Bevo, ice cream, corn syrup, and even truck bodies for police vans. But they had kept their breweries in pristine condition, waiting for this very day. As soon as repeal was announced, they were ready. Famously, August Busch Jr. arranged for a celebratory case of Budweiser to be delivered to President Roosevelt at the White House by a magnificent team of their Clydesdale horses, a brilliant piece of public relations that has become a famous part of their brand ever since. As the celebrations die down, however, we are left with the final, great scholarly debate of the Prohibition era. Looking back, what was its ultimate effect on the nation's health? The Dries had always warned that repeal would lead to a massive increase in the social ills of alcoholism. The Wets argued that the public health disaster of poisoned bootleg liquor was far worse. So, what happened? The data is complex. After 1933, rates of alcohol-related diseases like cirrhosis of the liver did indeed begin to climb again. But the new system of legal, regulated, and taxed alcohol also eliminated the problem of methanol poisoning and dismantled the criminal empires that had terrorized the nation. Historians on both sides of the issue can find statistics to support their case, and the debate over whether the repeal was a net positive or negative for public health continues. You are now sitting in a newly legal bar. It is brightly lit. There is a sign out front. You order a simple glass of beer, and it is served to you without a password, without a teacup, and without the fear of it being poison. The world feels simpler, more honest. You look back on the strange journey you have just taken. The noble experiment was one of the most fascinating and spectacular failures in American history. It was an attempt to legislate morality that instead created a golden age for organized crime. It was an attempt to protect the family that gave rise to the speakeasy and the flapper. It was an attempt to promote public health that ended up poisoning thousands of its own citizens. The legacy of Prohibition is all around you. It's in the cocktail you drink, in the existence of the FBI which grew to fight the gangsters it created, and in the profound and lasting American skepticism towards government attempts to regulate private life. The long, strange, and often violent party of the Roaring Twenties is over, and a new era has begun. And now, As you finish that first, satisfying, legal drink, it is time for our story to end as well. Let the sound of the distant jazz band begin to fade into a soft, gentle hum. The bright lights of the newly opened bars grow dim and distant in your mind. The clatter of glasses and the cheerful voices of the celebration all melt away, leaving only a comfortable and profound quiet. The long, complicated story of the last 13 years, the speakeasies, the gangsters, the flappers, the law, it all recedes, becoming just another chapter in a history book, resting quietly on a shelf. There are no more laws to navigate, no more passwords to remember. There is only the feeling of your own quiet room, the gentle weight of your blanket, and the effortless rhythm of your own breathing. Let all the stories and all the thoughts of the day dissolve, and allow yourself to drift off into a peaceful, well-deserved, and deeply restful sleep.
Tới đây luôn á. lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có lỗ đâu, không quay không có lỗ. Nói xịn kìa chứ nói này quay đâu.
Thì chớp nhán nhán được rồi. Dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có lỗ đâu, không quay không có lỗ. Nói xịn kìa chứ nói này quay đâu.
Thì chớp nhán nhán được rồi. dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay như vậy. Nó không có đỏ. Má xịn kìa chứ nói vậy rồi đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán